What's going on, guys? It's me, Zach, bringing you guys another fantasy football video. In this one, I'm going to go over the rookie landing spots of about 10 running backs that were drafted in this year's NFL draft. I'll try and touch on all of the guys that I think could have relevance this season, but as always, if there's anybody that you guys think I missed or anybody else that you guys would want me to touch on, please do feel free to reach out to me in the comments. I'm happy to give you guys my opinion on anyone you have to bring up. This will be the second video I'll be putting out. I did the quarterback video earlier, so if you want to look at how I feel about the quarterback landing spots for fantasy, please do feel free to go watch that video. And then shortly after this, I'll be getting out the wide receiver and tight end videos for rookie landing spots. And then after that, we'll be sort of right into almost heading into draft season. So I'll start looking into my rankings, my projections, where I think values can go, and I'll try and touch on dynasty and auction and snake and all the different formats so I can give you guys as much information as possible. So yeah, it's been really exciting. Really starting to get excited for football again, even though we got just about 4 months before the NFL season starts. But we had the schedule get released earlier this week, so lots of excitement starting to buzz around the NFL. So super excited, and yeah, with that, let's get into the first player here. Obviously, it wouldn't be a rookie running back video without bringing up Bijan Robinson. He was the crown jewel of this year's NFL draft from a fantasy standpoint, and for good reason. He's an elite talent. He's clearly got all the tools to be a three-down workhorse running back, and he actually ended up in a pretty good spot. He was drafted with the number 8 selection to the Atlanta Falcons, and I know for a lot of you guys that might not seem like a super lucrative option just because this isn't going to be a team that scores a ton of fantasy points, but I actually really like it for him. Arthur Smith has made it very clear that he wants to run the piss out of the ball. That's a quote from him. Um, and I mean, Bijan's going to be really great at doing that. Their offensive line's really solid, and it was good enough to make Tyler Algier actually really fantasy relevant last season. Personally, I think it's a bad draft pick by the Atlanta Falcons from a football standpoint, just because they had Algier, and I actually like Algier quite a bit. But Algier is not going to do anything to Bijan's value. They would not have drafted Bijan with the 8th overall pick if they didn't intend to give him 300 plus touches this season. And honestly, I think Bijan's going to have probably a top 5 season in redraft for the running back position, maybe even higher. I think we might see him catch a lot more passes than people expect him to. Ritter didn't really air the ball out too much last season. I think there's an opportunity for a lot of checkdowns to Bijan as well. The only real issue for me with Bijan right now would be the touchdown opportunity might be limited. This is going to be a team that really isn't going to score a whole lot of points. They're going to try and play defense, slow the game down by running the ball. So nothing super sexy there from the touchdown standpoint, but I still think he's got a shot at double-digit touchdowns this season. And I mean, there's room to grow there. If the Falcons do surprise us, if Ritter's better than we expected, maybe we see Taylor Heineke. There's plenty of reason to believe that this team could be a little bit better than they were last year. And if that happens, then really Bijan could be just an absolute monster this season. And obviously in Dynasty, he's probably the running back 1 going forward. Next up, we've got Shamir Gibbs, who I think is another player that honestly got drafted by a team that probably shouldn't have drafted him from a football standpoint. He's a really great player, but the Lions did not need a draft running back. They already had David Montgomery and DeAndre Swift on the roster. But with that said, they clearly have a plan for him. He's an elite pass catcher that got drafted to an elite offense, and they wouldn't have spent the 12th overall pick on him if they didn't intend to use him a ton. He probably won't get the majority of the rushing work. I would expect David Montgomery to get that. He'll probably lose the goal line work to David Montgomery as well. But despite that, there's a ton of opportunity for the running backs in this offense. We saw over 20 total touchdowns from these running backs last season. This is a team that scores the ball a ton, and they love checking the ball down to the running backs as well. We've seen Swift and Jamal Williams be very useful in the passing game, so there's a lot of reasons to be really excited about Shamir Gibbs here. He's already been compared by Dan Campbell to Alvin Kamara quite a bit. And honestly, I see the comps there. I think he's a really athletic pass catcher. He's going to be really explosive with the ball in his hands. And I think that he doesn't necessarily need a ton of touches to really be super fantasy viable. I'd expect him to get somewhere in the 10 to 15 touches, probably closer to 15 per game this season. But those are going to be high value touches. He's probably going to get 5 receptions a game and maybe 5 to 10 carries each game as well. Obviously, there's limited upside just because he's not going to get that elite volume, but if something were to happen to David Montgomery, or if he just has a spike touchdown season for whatever reason, he could have really a ton of upside this season. I think I'm going to have him ranked as like a high-end running back 2. Currently, I've got him looking right around that running back 13 to 14 spot, but there's obvious upside here, and honestly, I might end up moving him up in my rankings throughout the offseason. Next up, we've got Zach Charbonnet, who is a guy that I was super excited about coming into the NFL draft, but unfortunately the landing spot for him is just a really big bummer. He's got all the tools to be a feature running back, but he was drafted to the Seattle Seahawks in the 2nd round. They did spend pretty high draft capital on him, so he's clearly viewed as a really good player by them, but it just doesn't really make sense for them to have drafted him. They already had Kenneth Walker on the roster, and they drafted McIntosh in the 6th round as well, so they've got plenty of running backs on this roster. Zach Charbonnet, I think, is going to probably get about 40% of the touches. I do expect him to get more of the pass catching work than Kenneth Walker because he does just profile a little bit better of a pass catcher there. But honestly, I think that this really does sort of neuter both Ken Walker and Charbonnet. The Seahawks offense could be better this season than it was last year. They added Jackson Smith and Jigba, and they added, obviously, Zach Charbonnet. So there's lots of reasons to believe that this offense could put up a lot of points. Their defense is not fantastic. They did invest pretty heavily in their secondary, but their run defense is going to be awful again. They don't really have any interior linebackers, so I expect this team to really get gashed up front quite a bit. They'll give up a lot of points, and they'll need to score to keep up. With that being said, I think that you're probably looking at a 500-yard season, 5 to 6 touchdowns, and maybe 40 catches this season out of Charbonnet, and that's good enough for him to be like a running back 30, running back 35 sort of guy right now, but there is obvious upside for him if Kenneth Walker were to miss time. The Seahawks have a super early bye this season in Week 5. They have one stretch where they play 3 games in 12 days, and we already saw Kenneth Walker get injured last season, so it is possible to see Kenneth Walker miss some time, and in those weeks, I think Charbonnet would be a smash play. So I like Charbonnet. I think he's a guy that you could comfortably leave drafts with as your running back 3 or 4 in but there's no real upside here without an injury. And the last guy here that I really like from a fantasy standpoint this season is going to be Devon Akers. I think he's a really talented player. He's not huge, but he's just super fast, and he's going to fit really well into this Miami offense. They picked him in the early 3rd round, and he's honestly got pretty limited competition for touches in this offense. They have Raheem Mostert and Jeff Wilson. They also brought back Myles Gaskin, and I'm blanking on the other guy's name, but really nobody that stands out too much for you from a standpoint of actually being super talented. Mostert and Wilson were their main guys last season, and they're both getting up there in age. They've both got a pretty long list of injury history, so there's definitely going to be an opportunity for Devon Akers to get involved here. He's probably too small to be a true workhorse. I don't think you're going to see him get those 300 touches, but I think he's going to fit really nicely into that role that they might have envisioned Chase Edmonds filling last season when they gave him that contract. I think he's going to be a nice pass-catching guy. He'll probably sprinkle in for a couple rush attempts through each game as well here, but I think there's just going to be a lot of opportunity in this offense for guys underneath. Obviously, Waddle and Tyreek Hill take the top off of defenses for this team. So Devon Akers is going to have plenty of opportunities to catch a lot of passes, and there's obvious upside here if any of the other running backs were to get hurt. So I think I'm going to have him listed as a low-end running back 3 as well, and there's obviously upside for him if he either takes on a larger role than I expect or if there are injuries elsewhere. Well, now we're getting into the guys that I'm not super excited about. We've got Kendrick Miller here. He's a mediocre athlete in general. He was drafted in the 3rd or 4th round to the New Orleans Saints. It's a decent landing spot in terms of him getting an opportunity to see the field early on this season. I think it's reasonable to assume that Alvin Kamara is going to see a suspension, at least to start this season. But with that being said, Jamal Williams was brought into New Orleans. Williams will lead this backfield in touches if Kamara misses time, and honestly, I don't think Kendrick Miller is good enough to really steal too much valuable work. Obviously, Jamal Williams is going to get the goal line work. Kamara is obviously the pass catcher, and honestly, Jamal Williams is a better pass catcher than Kendrick Miller too. So I think you'll see Miller be a special teamer. Maybe he'll come in for 5 touches a game. I think in general you can ignore him in redraft, but he does have an opportunity to carve out a role in the future because there's just a lot of ambiguity at this position for the Saints. Kamara could move on after this year, and then obviously Jamal Williams. They give him a 3-year deal, but it's pretty front heavy for the first 2 years, so 2 years from now we could be looking at Kendrick Miller as the guy in New Orleans if he actually carves out a role and shows some talent. Chase Brown is actually a guy I'm pretty excited about. He was drafted in the 5th round by the Cincinnati Bengals, and I'm honestly just excited about him because I think he's actually a good player, and he got a really good landing spot here. He was drafted to the Bengals, who may or may not cut Joe Mixon before the start of the season. There's also the possibility of Joe Mixon receiving a suspension before the season starts. And outside of Joe Mixon, there's just Travion Williams and Chase Brown. There's just not a whole lot of target or running back competition there, especially if Joe Mixon leaves. So there is a real world that exists where Chase Brown ends up being a workhorse for this Cincinnati offense. He's a really great athlete. He can do everything you want out of a running back. He can catch the ball, pass protect. He can run the ball. He's got home run speed, and he's got plenty of size to take on actually a really significant workload. The obvious requirement for this to happen is going to be Joe Mixon to move on, but he could absolutely be a steal right now in drafts if you're playing best ball. I think I love drafting Chase Brown towards the end of your draft just to see what happens with Mixon. But regardless, I think he's good enough that he could have a nice Samaj P. Ryan role if Mixon stays. And if Mixon does go, there's certainly an opportunity here for him to be a running back too this season. Next up here, we've got Roshan Johnson. He was drafted in the 4th round by the Chicago Bears. I'm not super excited about him here. I think he's a generally mediocre talent, and I think Khalil Herbert's actually a really good player, but there is a decent landing spot here for him with Herbert and Foreman being the only competition for him for carries. Obviously, neither of those two guys are really proven on the NFL field, so there's certainly an opportunity here. And if he does end up being a good player, then there is a path for Roshan Johnson to get touches in this offense. But I still view him as the running back 3 in Chicago. This isn't going to be an offense that scores a ton of points. I think in general you could ignore him unless you want him as like a late round flyer. But he could be a guy that gets involved. He could be a waiver pickup if there's an injury to Foreman or Khalil Herbert during the season. And in Dynasty, I think you could draft him and just stash him on your bench to see what happens because there is a path. But I personally am not a believer in the talent, and I would just sort of look elsewhere. Next up, we've got Taj Spears. He was drafted by the Tennessee Titans to be Derrick Henry's backup. I think they did this because they saw enough of Hassan Haskins last season. They just obviously didn't like what they saw on the field, and honestly, I didn't either. I don't think Haskins is much of a talent anymore. So Taj Spears is going to be their backup running back, and Derrick Henry has been mentioned in trade rumors, so he could be moved, which would give Taj Spears a really huge role in this offense. The Titans' offense, however, is probably going to struggle again. The offensive line was a struggle for them this last season. They did address it in the draft this season, but you never really know with rookie offensive linemen. And there's questions at the quarterback position. They don't really have a good receiving core, so this offense will run through the running back position. So Spears could get enough volume to be fantasy relevant, but I don't think he's really going to be super valuable this season unless Derrick Henry moves. But with that being said, I think he could be a decent dynasty asset because I think this is probably Derrick Henry's last year in Tennessee, regardless. So after that, Spears could be in line for a big workload. So if you're in a dynasty league and you're not a contender this year, I like Spears. And in redraft, I think you could draft him as a handcuff to Derrick Henry, but that's about all the value he has unless Henry's moved. Next, we've got Tank Bixby. He's got a pretty fun name there. He's drafted in the 3rd round by the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I actually do like this landing spot. I think he's a decent player, and we did see JaMychal Hasty have some value last season. We saw ETN miss some games as well, and ETN honestly likely can't take on a 20-plus touch role. He's just not that big of a player. He's got an injury history. I don't think they want to give him that much of a workload. I think obviously ETN's going to lead this backfield in touches, but I think it's reasonable to assume that Bixby could get 10-ish touches a game, and if that happens, he could be really fantasy relevant, especially if he manages to steal that goal line work from ETN. It makes sense that he could do that. And there's not a whole lot of competition outside of ETN. They did bring Roshan Johnson in, so that could muddy the waters for him a little bit. But I think Bixby could be a guy that I'm targeting late in drafts as a guy that I think is going to probably carve in his role as that RB2 in Jacksonville, and anytime ETN were to miss time, I think it'd be a really good start. And last year we've got Evan Hull. He profiles as pretty much just a pass catching running back. He's really small, but he could take over that Naheem Hines role in Indianapolis. I really doubt that Anthony Richardson is going to be the kind of guy that dumps the ball down to the running back very often. We often see that with mobile quarterbacks. Why would they dump it down to the running back when they can just run it themselves? So I think there's a really limited role for him here in general. This isn't going to be an offense that scores the ball enough or passes the ball enough to really be one that could support 2 running backs, and obviously Jonathan Taylor is going to get the lion's share of the work here. So and in general, this isn't an offense that we've seen run in Philly with Shane Steichen coming over that really is going to pass the ball to the running backs a whole lot. We never really saw Miles Sanders get too many targets from Jalen Hurts, and I think you're going to see a really similar offense out of the Colts this season. So in general, I think you can ignore Evan Hull, but he's been brought up quite a bit in the fantasy space, so I thought I'd mention him. So that's going to do it for our running back recap here. Up next, we'll be giving you guys the wide receiver video. That one might be a little bit longer because there's probably more guys that could have an opportunity to be relevant. So stay tuned for that one. I'll probably get that one out in the next couple days. And if this is your first time on the channel, I do want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch the video. If you like the video and want more content like this, please do take the time to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Just over 300 subscribers right now, and I've got a maybe outrageous goal of hitting 1,000 by the end of this NFL season. So we'll see if we can do that, but it'd be super cool. I've loved watching the channel grow, and I love interacting with you guys. So with that being said, as well, if there's any questions you have or just want to talk about anything, please feel free to let me know in the comments. I love talking with you guys, and I'm happy to get back to you. So yeah, thank you guys so much, and I'll catch you next time.